Tristram Engelhardt, a Greek Orthodox philosopher of medicine at Baylor, and really a very eminent Christian medical ethicist, has written extensively about these issues, and he points out that a characteristic feature of contemporary culture is that it is marked by persistent and foundational moral disputes. We are living in an age when we really have a hard time getting along because there's these profound differences in the way that we look at the world, whether this is in politics or in medical ethics, etc. This is the sort of characteristic feature of our age, he observes. He goes on to write that many of the parties to these moral disputes find themselves embedded in morally and metaphysically incongruent understandings of proper human deportment, the significance of human life, and the nature of human flourishing. This moral diversity will have divergent implications regarding end-of-life decision-making and the use of high-cost, low-yield medical interventions. These are some of the issues I've already tried to argue. And so many have argued that given this kind of widely varying pluralistic situation where we've got so many different ways of looking at the world, that the default stance should be the godless stance. And this statement was drafted by Udo Schucklenk and colleagues who prepared the Royal Society of Canada expert report on end-of-life care in Canada. This was the document that really created or granted ethical permission for the legalization of euthanasia in Canada. And at some point, Schucklenk and colleagues are wrestling with the issue that for many of us, we see humans as made in the image of God, therefore they're sacred, and therefore we're unwilling to deliberately cause their death. But Schucklenk argues the underlying premise, namely that all humans are possessed of dignity and virtue of a special relationship to a God, is, however, incapable of being used as a basis of public policy proven in the context of a democratic, multicultural, and multi-faith society that must cleave to the strictures of public reason in ethical deliberation. And public reason is actually a technical term that you may or may not have heard before. The idea of public reason is that it requires that we adopt or adhere to moral or political rules that regulate our common life that are in some sense acceptable to everyone involved in the community. So Schucklenk's point is we can't make decisions about how we care for patients based on belief in God because not everybody accepts this. So we have to adopt instead a secular standpoint, which he assumed to be consistent with the strictures of public reason. So the question is, do secular foundational beliefs satisfy the strictures of public reason? The point here is that secularism is not a neutral position. It is not one overarching way of looking at the world that allows everyone from different worldviews to stand together. Rather, it adheres to specific assumptions about the nature of reality that bias or shape it, so that when secular ethicists are writing about their ethical views, they should be disclosing their own secularism as a conflict of interest. And so just some of the assumptions that secularism makes in relation to medical ethics is, for example, that humans matter. And Schucklenk and others who argue that we should provide good reasons for why we adhere to the foundational beliefs that we do, make no attempt to argue that humans matter or that autonomy should be respected or that one ought to accept a particular account of well-being or flourishing. These are all basic assumptions that they adhere to without any argument whatsoever. And crucially, what I want you to see is that secularism is not neutral. Again, I'll quote Engelhardt. He writes that the ideology of autonomy and equality, even if it were to reflect the morality that all did in fact embrace, cannot be shown by social, rational argument to be the morality that all should embrace. There is no independent perspective from which this moral perspective could, in principle, be justified. And so secular humanists, in other words, are relying on foundational beliefs that they make no attempt to argue for, just as much as Christian theists rely on belief in the existence of God to serve as a foundation for moral ethics in medicine. So we're all on the same footing in terms of the fact that we're coming to these issues with philosophical baggage. John Rawls, who is really probably the most famous political philosopher who wrestled with these issues of how do we get along in community, in a pluralistic society in such a way that we can ensure that justice is done, that satisfies everybody in the community, even if we have fundamentally different ways of looking at the world. You may have heard of his famous argument for justice from the veil of ignorance. Anybody, I don't know if anybody has encountered that notion of how you define fairness philosophically. But Rawls himself, who's a secular, recognized that secular reason is reasoning in terms of comprehensive non-religious doctrines. And if you're coming at an issue from a secular perspective, you're engaging doctrines and values that are much too broad to serve the purposes of public reason. And so, consequently, these secular philosophical doctrines do not provide public reasons for adopting public policy on particular issues in medical ethics. Secularism is not neutral, even according to John Rawls. In fact, depending on how you define religion, many people who are not religious could in fact be understood to be very religious. And this is because a way of looking at religion broadly is that it represents a search for the real in light of some concept of the good, some concept of the real in the search for the good. This is essentially a way of describing a worldview. And if you think about religion in this fashion, if you define religion as, or being religious as one holding that something has to be more important than everything else, and one must relate that something to everything else in some sort of pattern of subordination, or if it's a system of belief that describes some ultimate reality and some ultimate good, you are in a sense religious. And I would really encourage you, if you can carve out the time, to go and read this article by John Reeder in the Journal of Religious Ethics. It's an old paper, but it's really honestly very worthwhile because he makes it so plain that even those who adhere to no belief in God whatsoever, insofar as they still live with some concept of the real and the search for the good, are actually religious believers.